Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Shadows of Edgar's Castle. In the dark forest of the American South stood an ancient castle, known to the locals as Edgar's Castle. Its first inhabitants made it famous as a place where reality and myth converged, where dark magic and secret rituals became part of everyday life. Built in the mid-1800s, the castle symbolized the ancient Edgar family, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the entire American Southwest. Everyone said terrible things happened here, from gruesome deaths to dark rituals. Over time, after the last Edgar passed away, the castle began to decay. Its walls started to be covered in moss, and the doors and windows grew more weathered. But what remained inside the castle was even more terrifying. The locals constantly shared stories about strange sounds coming from the castle at night, about shadows moving through dark corridors, and about animal-like screams echoing from one of the tallest towers. However, most people were afraid to approach, believing the castle to be cursed. The story grew darker when a young journalist, Susan Gray, decided to investigate these rumors and uncover the castle's secrets. She set off for the Southwest, hoping not only to get an interesting article but also to unravel the mysteries hidden in the shadow of this grand but grim place. She believed the myths surrounding the castle were exaggerated and that nothing truly terrifying was happening there. Upon arriving at the castle, she felt like an outsider, as if she had crossed some invisible boundary. But she paid no attention to these feelings. Her goal was to learn more about the dark legacy of the place. Just hours after entering the castle, Susan began to notice something strange. A wall that seemed perfectly normal was pierced by a pale glow, as if it were part of some otherworldly realm. She heard odd sounds, a rustling coming from deep within the corridors, and an unexplained smell that reminded her of stagnant water. The next day, Susan ventured into the castle's library, hoping to find any records or books that could shed more light on its history. There, she stumbled upon an old archive containing records of magical rituals that had taken place in the castle. It turned out that the Edgar family was not only wealthy but also notorious for their connections to occult circles that practiced dark rituals. Step by step, Susan uncovered that the castle had been built specifically for such rites, and its location was perfect for dark rituals meant to open a path between the world of the living and the afterlife. She found records of deadly ceremonies in which victims were tied to special stone slabs and subjected to horrifying rites aimed at gaining power over souls. During one of her investigations, she accidentally discovered an ancient door lock not mentioned in the castle's blueprints. It led to a basement no one from the local area had ever mentioned. Susan decided to go down, feeling her heart pound with fear. As she descended, she found a small room flooded with water. In the center of the room stood an ancient statue that seemed familiar to her. When she approached, her eyes were drawn to an inscription on the stone next to the statue: "Those who betray will find peace only in darkness." Suddenly, she felt someone, approaching her, and her heart raced. She turned and saw the door slowly closing behind her. Panic took hold, but she tried to steady herself, realizing she had to act quickly. In the following days, Susan continued to dig deeper, uncovering more terrifying secrets of the castle. It turned out the castle's owners had repeatedly tried to escape from what they had awakened, but the tortured souls of the victims never allowed them peace. This was why the castle had become what it was now, frozen in time, a place where nothing had power. In the final moments of her stay at the castle, as she tried to find an exit, Susan realized she was not alone. Invisible presences followed her, sensing her fear and catching her mistakes. They were closing in. And even when she thought she had escaped, she was met at the castle's threshold by the last and most terrifying creature of this place, the soul of Edgar himself. Susan understood that all these years, she had not just been a witness to the castle's history. She had become part of its legacy. And now, she was its new victim. When Susan tried to approach the castle doors to escape, her heart raced faster. The feeling that she was not alone became unbearably strong. Every step she took on the ancient stone floor echoed with a dull thud, as if someone was following her, someone who could only observe or chase. She knew she should never have returned to this place, that she had made a mistake trying to uncover its terrifying secrets, but now it was too late. The skirts of her coat caught on the floor, and when she turned around, standing before her was the same man whose statue she had seen in the dungeon. He was tall, with dark eyes that glowed with coldness and unspeakable pain. His face, though made of ancient scars and smeared marks, held an indescribable depth, as if he was something more than just a man. His dark clothes, ruined by time and fire, resembled a shadow that had come to life. In his hands was a large, gleaming dagger that reflected the light. You've become part of me," he whispered, his voice like the rustling wind through the empty corridors of the castle. Susan couldn't believe her eyes. She felt the cold grip her as this man, or what was once a man, moved closer. His movements were slow, but she sensed an incredible power in them. Power he had gained through countless dark rituals, through his own betrayal, through losing his soul in the search for immortality. "You can't escape," he said, and it wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. Her actions could no longer change anything. All her attempts, her struggles, her will, everything was hopeless. And then, just when Susan thought all was lost, a small crack appeared in the wall that had seemed solid. It was large enough for her to pass through. This was her only hope. She ran toward the crack, but as she touched the stone surface, she felt her hands turn cold, and the air around her grew even heavier. The wind, once gentle, now became fierce, like a knife's edge. She tried to widen the opening, but at that moment, a terrifying crack sounded, and another figure suddenly appeared before her, this one much larger, darker, and far more frightening. It was a dark figure that approached from behind her. She could feel her skin break out in cold sweat. As the figure drew near, Susan saw the horrific eyes glowing red in the dark. "You thought you could escape," this entity whispered, "but you have once again given your soul to the castle. You've become part of us again." Stunned and unable to move, she could only stand as the large black shadow began to consume everything around her, devouring the castle, herself, and even the moment in which she had experienced horror. And now, Susan was part of what remained of the castle. Her body no longer belonged to her. Her soul had become a part of this horrific legacy that had devoured so many others who had tried to touch its dark power. The castle seemed to breathe with her, sensing her fear, her struggle, and now it was her prison. Every movement, every glance of hers was directed toward becoming part of an immortal circle, where others, like her, had become shadows, victims whose blood had merged with the foundations of this terrifying structure. Now, she saw that not only Edgar was cursed. All who stepped onto this land became an inseparable part of the castle, its living walls, and its endless darkness. There was no returning now. Susan was no longer just a journalist. She had become yet another eternal presence in this place, and her screams had become part of the castle's song. Years passed, but the castle remained as unyielding, as terrifying, and as suffocating in its darkness. Stories about it never ceased. New journalists, locals, travelers, and even groups of researchers tried to break into it, convinced they could uncover the secrets of Edgar's castle. But none of them ever returned. The locals whispered about it in the shadows of old shops, telling children terrifying tales of lost souls who returned to the castle seeking salvation, only to become part of its horrific nature. They spoke of how anyone who approached the castle could feel an invisible pressure, as if the castle itself were awakening from its slumber and beginning to feed its insatiable power with the souls of others. But one new story would add another dark chapter to this horrifying legacy. It was the story of a researcher named Dave. He was another brave seeker of truth, unafraid even of the terrifying rumors surrounding the castle. He was convinced he could find the truth and perhaps even destroy the place once and for all. Dave arrived at the castle alone, with a camera and a notebook. His actions were courageous but also somewhat reckless. He didn't believe in supernatural forces, considering them to be mere products of human imagination and superstition. So, when he crossed the boundaries of the castle and stepped inside, his heart didn't beat with fear, but with excitement, for he was sure this was just another moment in his career as a fearless journalist. But when Dave stepped onto the old stone stairs leading to the deeper parts of the castle, something changed. He felt it, like a coldness slowly filling every cell of his body. The castle walls seemed alive, vibrating with some hidden life they kept within. The stones beneath his feet suddenly began to crack, as though they were whispering to him in the silence. Dave frowned, trying to calm himself, but when he stopped in one of the hallways and looked into the darkness, a wave of cold hit him in the back. It pulled him to the ground, and a strange smell filled the air, a smell of decaying, long-forgotten bodies, a smell that brought forth memories of long-buried fears. He turned around and saw a figure before him. It was shrouded in mist, but he felt his body freeze in terror, For there it was, the soul of Edgar himself. Dave realized that this wasn't just a myth, not just a story. This was a real, horrifying presence that existed here, within these walls. "You will not leave here," it echoed in his head, and it wasn't just a voice. It was a sensation that every movement and thought of his had already become part of this dark force. Dave tried to flee, but he felt his legs betray him. His body grew heavy, his breathing labored, and the air that once seemed normal now suffocated him. The stones began to shift around him, forming a wall that slowly closed off all exits. "This is your place now," whispered the shadow, and Dave realized he wasn't just a victim. He had become part of the castle. Like others before him, Dave remained inside the castle, but his presence was invisible to any future travelers. He became part of this place. His soul vanished into the shadow, consumed by the castle itself. But sometimes, at night, when the wind blows through the forests and the sky is covered with clouds, strange sounds can be heard. You can hear footsteps and whispers, and you might see shadows moving between shadows. The story of Edgar's castle will never end, for its walls have consumed many lives, and everyone who approaches it will no longer be the same. The castle transforms them, makes them part of itself, so they become new shadows among the dead, whose souls will forever wander the corridors, searching for an exit that no longer exists. The night was dark, cold, and the winds howled as if the earth itself was trying to shift. The castle stood like a black rock in the forest, its towers reaching up to the sky like charred fingers of a dead hand, trying to grasp the last breath of life. But this time, something had changed. Those who passed by the castle spoke of a strange light that appeared in its windows. A light that wasn't ordinary. It seemed to pulse, flicker, but not from lanterns or torches. It was a glow that frightened even the staunchest skeptics. And another thing, those who got close began to experience horrifying visions. Their eyes saw things that shouldn't exist. A few days ago, a group of new, desperate researchers arrived at the castle, confident that they could find the true source of the curse. They weren't as naive as the previous travelers. They knew the myths and had heard the terrifying stories. However, none of them were prepared for what happened when they crossed the threshold. As soon as they entered, they realized the castle didn't just consume souls, it lived and even felt them. The first step into the dark hall was difficult, and immediately one of the women felt something heavy squeeze her heart. She looked around, but only saw emptiness. Then her gaze lingered on an old mirror hanging on the wall, like an ancient relic. She raised her hand to touch it, but suddenly, as if invisible fingers were at work, the mirror began to darken, turning into blackness. Her face distorted like in a nightmare, and from the darkness, faces began to appear. These were the faces of former victims, but they were not mere images. They moved, they were alive. With a scream, she recoiled from the mirror, but it didn't help. Her eyes darted around the room, as if trying to hide from something impossible. And then the walls began to seem alive. The stones under her feet started moving, scratching and grinding. The place filled with muffled voices echoing through the castle, whispering and saying only one word, "Return." Those who were nearby felt their hearts freeze, fear seeping into their blood. But what was even more terrifying was that they began to lose their sense of time. Things that once seemed familiar became strange and foreign, and their shadows seemed to break free from their control. Every step in the castle became a burden. And when one of them turned to an ancient painting hanging on the wall, the eyes in the painting began to move. The pages of the diary he held seemed to come alive, rewriting their own history. They recalled everything: death, curses, souls that lost their peace. And these words were spoken even through centuries. "You didn't come here for answers. You came here to become part of us." A few hours later, when one of the researchers tried to find an exit, he heard a crack, like fire burning through trees. But there was no fire. It was only a sound of rupture, tearing through the walls of the castle, like rivers of blood rushing from the depths of the earth. And with every step, they lost more of their human semblance. It seemed as if their bodies were turning to dust. Their screams became echoes that scattered through the rooms. But the most terrifying thing was that their souls were already in the castle. With every passing hour, as they tried to escape, the castle opened more. Again and again, those same shadows appeared, old extinguished souls that haunted them at every step, hindering even the very air. The shadows watched, whispered, and when one of the researchers' hands touched the massive doors deep within the castle, they briefly opened, and darkness poured out, an endless abyss. Since then, there has been no day or night in the castle. It was only a misty nightmare that lived forever. The last of the researchers were consumed by the darkness, swallowed by every wall, every stone. They became part of the castle. And the castle waits. It has no boundaries. And now, when you hear stories about this place, be careful. For you are not just listening to them, you are becoming part of this legend, part of its eternal darkness. And the castle will wait for the next one who returns to it. Several years passed. The forest surrounding the castle had changed. The trees grew darker, their trunks twisted with dark vines, as if the castle had begun to influence nature itself. People avoided the area, but one story, one truth, still made its way into the world. Whether it was true or just another terrifying tale, it was repeated everywhere. A young girl named Lily gathered her courage and ventured into that place. She hadn't heard the story, for she was not afraid. She was determined. She wanted to uncover the truth. Lily was one of those who seemed to never believe in ghosts or curses. As soon as she crossed the threshold of the castle, it felt as if everything around her froze. At first, she thought it was just an ordinary gloomy house, abandoned and forgotten. But then she began to feel the silence growing heavy, almost unbearable. And she saw them. Shadows. Shadows with faces. Shadows with eyes that burned with pain and fear. They followed her, hindering every movement she made. The footsteps behind her didn't seem like her own, but someone else's, belonging to a body that had long become part of this place. Lily didn't give up. She continued. But every step grew heavier. Every move seemed to be pushed by an invisible force. And at that moment, she saw what she shouldn't have seen. Deep within the castle, she found a room. It was an ancient hall that at first glance appeared to be ordinary. But in its center, there was something strange. It was a round stone, black with patterns that faintly glowed in the dark. There was an inscription on it. The same words that Lily had heard in her dreams as she walked through the forest. Those who come will not leave. Those who seek answers will not find them. The castle waits. The castle is alive, and it needs sacrifices. When Lily tried to touch the stone, something dreadful happened. The stone exploded with a silent burst, and suddenly everything around her froze. She saw what had not been visible before. Shadows creeping from every crack, from every part of the walls, slowly, almost predatory, moving toward her. She felt them filling every cell of her body. And then she understood. Her attempt to escape, her struggle against the castle, it had all been in vain. She had become part of its circle, part of this eternal nightmare. And just like all those before her, she felt her soul being slowly consumed. The castle had swallowed her, and her face became just another shadow among those wandering its walls. All her efforts were powerless. She was already part of its dark nature. Since then, the castle remained as it had always been, unshaken. No one else tried to approach it because everyone knew, the castle waits. And anyone who steps into its shadows will never leave alive. Those who came for the truth became part of the endless nightmare, which now was their home. And even when someone seeks this place, they will never find an exit. They will only find the castle that demands sacrifices. The castle that lives, that waits for its next soul. And it will wait. Forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.